On August 17, 1980, a 9-week-old baby disappeared from a tent near Uluru. Her mother said a dingo took her. Australia did not believe her. The state prosecuted her instead. It took 4 inquests, 6 years in prison, and 32 years before the official record acknowledged what Gurindji Chamberlain had said from the first night. But that is not the most disturbing thing about the Northern Territory. The most disturbing thing is that the Chamberlain case is not even the worst thing that has happened here. The Northern Territory covers 1.35 million square kilometres with a population of roughly 250,000. By almost every measure of disadvantage, crisis, and institutional failure, it is the most troubled jurisdiction in Australia. Its Aboriginal incarceration rate is among the highest of any jurisdiction in the developed world. Its rates of child malnutrition, domestic violence, and suicide in remote communities exceed those of most developing nations. The gap in life expectancy between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Territorians is larger here than anywhere else in the country. Every year, millions visit for Uluru, Kakadu, the jumping crocodiles, the red dirt and the sky. They see one Northern Territory. The other is harder to reach, harder to look at, and largely absent from the tourism infrastructure. In this video, we examine 13 things the Territory would prefer you not examine too closely. Stay to the end. Number 1 is happening right now, in the Territory's youth detention system, documented in a royal commission whose findings have been only partially implemented, and whose subject matter forced an emergency Prime Ministerial response within 48 hours when broadcast on national television in 2016. Subscribe. Begin. The Northern Territory is not a state. It is governed under Commonwealth legislation, without full constitutional status, its self-government granted in 1978 and capable of being overridden by Canberra. The Territory's crises are partly products of federal decisions made in Canberra rather than Darwin. The Larrakia, Arrernte, Yolngu, Anangu, and Gurindji peoples, the dozens of Aboriginal nations whose country covers the Territory, have been here for at least 65,000 years. 13 things about the place they are still living. Starting now. Number 13. The Wave Hill Walk-Off. On August 23, 1966, 200 Gurindji workers walked off Wave Hill Cattle Station in the Victoria River District, led by stockman Vincent Lingiari. They walked to Wadi Creek, Gurindji, and camped. They said they were not going back. Wave Hill was owned by the British company Vesties. The Gurindji had worked the station for generations, performing the skilled stockwork that made the cattle industry viable. They were paid rations, tea, flour, sugar, not wages, and were not permitted to leave without permission. By any measure, indentured labour. The walk-off began as a wages dispute and within months became a land claim. Lingiari and the Gurindji were demanding the country taken from them. The walk-off lasted 9 years. In 1975, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam flew to Gurindji, poured red dirt into Lingiari's palm, and handed back a portion of Gurindji traditional country, a photograph that became one of the most significant images in Australian political history. The walk-off preceded the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976 and changed the political landscape of Aboriginal Australia. It is not taught the way the 1967 referendum is, and remains less commemorated than the event's significance warrants. Number 12. Bombing of Darwin. On February 19, 1942, Japanese forces attacked Darwin in the largest foreign attack on Australian soil in history. A fleet of 188 aircraft, more than attacked Pearl Harbor, struck in 2 waves. Ships were sunk. The town was destroyed. The official death toll was 243. Subsequent research suggests the actual toll exceeded 1,000 when all service personnel, civilians, and ship crews are counted. The low official toll wasn't administrative error. It was a deliberate decision to suppress the attack scale to prevent civilian panic. Eyewitnesses were warned not to speak. The military failure that let 188 aircraft reach Darwin unopposed was managed as a public information problem rather than acknowledged as a disaster. Darwin was bombed 6 to 4 times during the war, not widely known by Australians who associate the country's wartime experience primarily with Gallipoli, Kokoda, and Changi. The Territory was Australia's Pacific War frontline, and the decision to suppress the scale of February 19 has never produced the formal accounting it warrants. Number 11. The Azaria Chamberlain Case. On August 17, 1980, Azaria Chamberlain, 9 weeks old, disappeared from a tent at Uluru. Her mother Lindy reported a dingo had taken her. What followed is one of the most comprehensive miscarriages of justice in Australian legal history. Lindy was convicted of murder in 1982 based on forensic evidence, expert testimony about bloodstains and cut marks that subsequent science proved profoundly flawed. She was released in 1986 when Azaria's jacket was found near a dingo lair. Convictions were quashed in 1988. In 2012, a fourth inquest finally confirmed a dingo had taken and killed the baby, the finding Lindy had stated from the first night. The territory's landscape created the evidential context when innocent explanation became unbelievable to a jury. The remoteness of Uluru, the darkness, the territory's quality of producing events that resist ordinary frameworks, these contributed to the disbelief that produced a wrongful conviction. Expert witnesses overstated their certainty. A jury trusted them. A woman spent 6 years in prison because the truth was less believable than the prosecution's narrative. Number 10. The NT emergency response and what it produced. In June 2007, the Little Children, a Sacred report documented child sexual abuse in remote territory communities as a crisis requiring urgent response. Within weeks, Prime Minister Howard announced the NT emergency response, the intervention. Military personnel and police were dispatched to remote communities. The Racial Discrimination Act was suspended. Welfare payments were quarantined. Land tenure was changed. Children were medically examined. It was the most significant exercise of Commonwealth power over the territory since self-government in 1978. The stated purpose was child protection. The research on outcomes is contested. What is documented? The communities subject to the intervention did not show consistent improvements in the child health outcomes stated. The suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act was condemned as a violation of international human rights obligations. Communities described the military presence, income management, and paternalistic structure as fundamentally at odds with the self-determination they had been building for decades. The intervention was extended, modified, and rebranded across successive governments. Its measures continue in altered forms. The Little Children, a Sacred report had recommended community-based solutions. The intervention was something else entirely. Number 9. Alice Springs and the crisis it contains. Alice Springs is the base for Uluru, Kings Canyon, and the McDonnell Ranges, marketed as one of Australia's most extraordinary travel destinations. It is also, by multiple social indicators, one of the most distressed regional towns in Australia. Assault, domestic violence, and alcohol-related harm rates among the highest of any comparable Australian town. The Alice Springs crime surge of 2022 to 2023 brought the crisis to national attention. Youth crime and public disorder reached levels producing emergency federal intervention and a Prime Ministerial visit. Media coverage documented behaviour without understanding what had produced it. Decisions about housing, community services, and alcohol management accumulated over decades. The surge was new. The conditions were not. The crisis is the intersection of remote community populations travelling to town for services, inadequate housing producing overcrowding, chronic underfunding, and the governance gap the territory status creates. None of it appeared suddenly in 2022. Number 8. Kakadu and its ongoing tensions. Kakadu is listed on the World Heritage Register for both natural and cultural values, the wetlands, the rock art, the Binange, and Mungwi people's living connection to country. Jointly managed by traditional owners and the Commonwealth, it was, when established in the 1980s, among the most progressive land management frameworks in the world. The Jabiluka uranium deposit within Kakadu's boundaries produced one of Australia's most significant environmental campaigns in the late 1990s. The Mirarr people, traditional owners of the area, opposed mining. The campaign produced UNESCO review of the World Heritage listing and eventually the project suspension. The deposit remains undeveloped. Kakadu is one of Australia's more successful examples of Aboriginal land management. It also demonstrates how economic interests surrounding Aboriginal country create continuous pressure against the arrangement. Pressure traditional owners must resist repeatedly, not once. The Mirarr suspended the Jabiluka question. They did not resolve it permanently. Number 7. Don Dale and the Royal Commission. On July 25, 2016, the ABC's Four Corners broadcast footage from inside Don Dale Youth Detention Centre in Darwin. Young Aboriginal detainees, some as young as 13, were shown being tear-gassed, hooded with spit hoods, stripped and restrained in chairs. The programme's title described it in one word: Australia shame. The footage had been obtained through freedom of information. The treatment was systematic. Prime Minister Turnbull announced a royal commission within 48 hours, the speed itself a measure of the footage's impact. The commission made 227 recommendations. It documented systematic abuse at Don Dale and other Territory youth facilities, the failures of child protection that placed children in detention, and the pathway from poverty, inadequate housing, and family violence into youth justice. Implementation has been partial. Don Dale remains operational. Number 6. The Aboriginal incarceration rate. Aboriginal people are roughly 30% of the Territory's population and roughly 85% of its prison population, a per capita rate among the highest documented for any population group anywhere on Earth. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody reported in 1991, documenting this rate as a primary concern and recommending ways to reduce it. 30 years later, the rate has increased. The mandatory sentencing regime from 1997 to 2001, requiring imprisonment for certain property offences regardless of circumstances, was condemned by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The laws were eventually repealed. Their legacy in the Territory's sentencing culture persisted. The causes are documented: poverty, inadequate housing, intergenerational consequences of dispossession, inadequate legal services in remote communities, mandatory sentencing legacy, and the relationship between the Territory's justice system and the communities it most frequently processes. The world's highest Aboriginal incarceration rate is documented, explained, and ongoing. It is not in the tourism marketing. Number 5. The Uluru climb and the ban. For the Anangu people, Uluru is the center of their cultural, spiritual, and ancestral world, sacred, not meant to be climbed. The Anangu said this clearly, in signage, in cultural interpretation, in repeated requests. For 34 years after receiving freehold title to their land, hundreds of thousands of people climbed it anyway. The climb was not banned until October 26, 2019. The argument many visitors made against the ban, that it was their right, that the landscape belonged to everyone, that traditional owners could not restrict access to a natural feature, reveals a specific view of whose cultural authority matters and whose does not. The climb is banned. The debate is over. What it revealed about the relationship between Australian tourism and Aboriginal cultural authority is not. Every protected area on Aboriginal country carries the same underlying question: whose authority determines how country is used? The Uluru ban answered it in one park. The question remains open everywhere else. Number 4. The saltwater crocodile risk. The Territory's rivers, estuaries, and coastal areas hold one of the largest saltwater crocodile populations on Earth, an estimated 100,000 animals after the 1971 hunting ban. Attacks occur with irregularity, producing a specific risk management framework, warning signs, prohibited swimming areas, public education campaigns. The attacks receiving most attention are tourists entering water the framework warns against: the Darwin waterfront, Litchfield National Park waterfalls, and river systems around Kakadu all carry warnings not always heeded. The attacks the Territory manages most consistently are those in remote communities and on pastoral properties where Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Territorians live beside the same waterways. For these populations, crocodile risk is a daily management reality, not a tourist warning. The gap between warnings issued and behaviour produced is documented in the attack record. The management program is sophisticated. The attacks continue. Number 3. The suicide crisis in remote communities. The suicide rate in remote NT Aboriginal communities is among the highest of any population group in Australia and in the developed world. Young Aboriginal men in their teens and 20s are dying by suicide at rates that would produce a national emergency response proportional to their scale in a non-Aboriginal population. The causes are documented: intergenerational trauma of dispossession and stolen generations, disruption to cultural continuity whose well-being was inseparable from connection to country, inadequate mental health services where a psychologist may visit once a month and crisis services are hours away, unemployment, overcrowding, and family violence concentrated in the highest rate communities. Investment in mental health services has increased, and community-controlled health organisations have developed culturally appropriate programs showing results where they operate adequately. The rate has not declined to the level the investment should produce. The communities with the highest rates are furthest from services. The crisis is documented, ongoing, and not receiving the national political attention its scale warrants. Number 1. What the Territory reveals. The Northern Territory is the part of Australia that makes the country's promises most visible in their failure: equal citizenship, justice, health, promises the land rights movement, reconciliation, close the gap, the Royal Commissions and parliamentary apologies have collectively made to Aboriginal Australia. The Territory is where you can measure the gap between those promises and what has actually been produced. The Gurindji walk-off forced land rights legislation, and it was real, but land and services on it are still two different things. Don Dale footage forced a royal commission with 227 recommendations. Implementation has been partial, and children who will be the next Four Corners broadcast are already in the system. The Uluru climb ban was 34 years late. The incarceration rate has increased since the Royal Commission that said it must decrease. The suicide crisis is documented and underfunded. The intervention continues in altered forms, its fundamental structure, federal power rather than community self-determination, unchanged. There are genuine achievements: the land right system, joint management of parks, the community-controlled health sector, the cultural preservation Aboriginal Territorians have sustained despite everything. These are real. But the territory is also the place where Australia's relationship with its First Peoples is most concentrated, most measurable, and most visible to anyone who looks at the data rather than the landscape. The 13 things in this video are not arguments for despair. They are arguments for accuracy, for understanding Australia's most extraordinary jurisdiction as it actually is, rather than as the tourism infrastructure presents it. See you in the next one.